English translation 709th Contact Part 2. Sunday the 29th of July 2018, 1:41 hours.
Okay, then the matter is clear to me that your orders will be carried out. Consequently, we need not discuss it further. However, if it is possible, I would have a few things to say about all that has been said so far, as well as a few more questions, if you have time to answer them.
There is really no hurry for us. Consequently, you can put forward your questions.
Good, thanks, but what I want to say will take some time. Though I want to ask first, Ptah, what your scriptural and linguistic experts explain regarding my question whether in German usage, soll or soll is correct.
I asked about this and received the answer that according to your question, it is not sole but soul that is correct. The basic root forms from the German, from which the German language emerged, have four should forms, which are also valid in German, namely soll, sollte, sollen, and gesollt, whereby the last leading type is based on the past tense of hatte and hatte. Consequently, the forms hat gesollt, and hatte gesollt are correct. Soll corresponds to an incorrect form of expression, which is wrong in the German language, and consequently, only soll is correct if a sentence ends with it or a corresponding sentence insertion with soll is given. The following sentence serves as an example. Something should only be correct if everything is also as it should be in the end. It was explained that a should never be used, because in the German language, which originated from the German, only a shall is correct, and therefore only such a shall can and should be used. A should is always wrong in any case, and thus falsifies the clear German verbal language and the equally clear German written language.
Good, thanks. Then I always have things to explain about you, Pleiaren, and the connections with you. It just never ends with my explanations that I have to give that you, Pleiaren, come from your space-time structure, Ankar universe, as you call your dimension, and that you only come to our Dern universe, and you are active there only in the SOL system, that is to say also only on Earth, but nowhere else in our entire Dern universe. Again and again I must also explain that when it is said that your peoples are also to be found with the Lyra, the Pleiaren, or beyond the galaxy sun or the Milky Way, etc., that this does not mean the stars and constellations in our Dern universe, but just such in your Ankar universe or Ankar space-time structure. And if celestial bodies in our space-time structure are mentioned as positions from which you can be found beyond, then it should finally be understood that this refers to your space-time structure, but unfortunately this is misunderstood again and again. It is also misunderstood again and again that when we speak of a space-time structure and a universe, we are only talking about the fourth matter belt and one of the 7 energy belts in creation. This explains that the universe is not the creation, so consequently, the creation is not the universe. Creation itself has 7 dimensions with 7 energy belts each, of which only one belt, the fourth, exists in each dimension as a matter belt, which is called the universe by the Earthlings. Whereby the Earthlings must first be laboriously made to understand that the universe they call the material belt is only the 7th part of one dimension of the 7 dimensions of creation. In this matter belt, precisely in this universe called by Earthlings, past, present, and future alone exist. This means that in the matter belts alone, past, present, and future dimensions or space-time structures are given in multiple forms and in endless numbers. While in the 7 dimensions of creation as such, as they are each arranged in the egg-shaped creation as a separate unit, there is only one single dimension, or one single space-time structure. These are therefore the 7 creational dimensions which prevail in the egg-shaped creation itself, and which in turn have 7 energy belts within them, whereby one of each of the 7 energy belts has a material belt in which uncountable dimensions or space-time structures of the past, present, and future exist.
To this, I think it is to be borne in mind that all those Earth humans who bring forward corresponding questions to you, as well as the entire Earth Human Guild of Astronomical Sciences, are in this respect not included in the education which my father Svath has bestowed upon you concerning creation and its dimensions, as well as universes and space-time structures, as well as the past, present, and future.
But it is still tedious to be pestered again and again with these questions, which are, after all, really only knowledge-based, but not consciousness evolution-based, and thus also not of a spirit teaching, aka creation energy-based matter.
That is probably also correct, but
Of course, I know that as a rule, sheer curiosity is confused with a thirst for knowledge, but in the process precisely that which is fundamentally of importance and significance. The teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, or the teaching of the spirit, comes short, is given short shrift.
then you know the score.
Yes, and with that I now also come to what I want to say and elaborate a little on all that was said before. And with regard to numbers and all kinds of other data and values, I will refer back to what we discussed together in a private way. So I will begin as follows with what I want to bring up and say. The number of overpopulation that has degenerated on Earth can no longer be denied, which is absolutely a cause for concern regarding the continued existence of Earth humans, the whole of nature, its fauna and flora, and even the planet. Simply as a result of the already widespread indifference to one another and the lack of reasonable communication and entertainment, the human beings of the Earth have grown apart. And through the needs, thirst, hunger and desires of the Earthlings for luxury, mobility and security, they have already irrevocably depleted the planet through intensive exploitation of all conceivable materials, such as rare earths, petroleum, gold, silver, coal, various ores, precious stones, as well as gases, etc., to such an extent that no regeneration is possible in the long term. The majority of all agricultural land worldwide is also in an extremely poor condition, with more than 40% of the once fertile land and its soils being severely to very severely impaired by acidification and chemical pollution, erosion, salinisation, and compaction, and being steadily more destroyed. And this also through overbuilding in terms of dwellings for the inexorably growing and already overwhelming overpopulation, through which inexorably more and more destructive and devastating machinations are being devised and exercised against nature, fauna, flora, and the planet itself. Erosion not only degrades the quality of natural foodstuffs, but also promotes the slow desertification and infertility of soils, ultimately creating desertification, through which much or all agricultural productivity is very much reduced or plummets to zero. In view of the still rampant development of overpopulation, it is the case that Earth humans today actually need 16 Earths of the same kind in order to satisfy the carrying and nourishing capacity of the planet with regard to human beings, which, given the nature of a planet, as is the case with the Earth, is to be calculated at 529 million. Only in this way, if earthly humanity had 16 such planets at its disposal and to exist on, could it continue as before, and even then only until overpopulation would arise again and a new planet would have to be sought for population. In view of the continued unreasonable and irresponsible population growth by Earthlings and their endlessly increasing demands, even if increased natural crop yields could be achieved by any new measures, there would already be more new planets needed to meet the Earth's limit of 529 million inhabitants. The fact is that the consequences of excessive overpopulation do not only affect their nutrition, but also specifically the health of the Earth's human beings, whose population on the 31st of December in 2017 was exactly 8844128002 or 8.844 billion Earth humans, while according to false earthly calculation assumptions, there are about 1 billion human beings less. Air pollution alone kills more than 7 million human beings every year, while about 1 billion human beings have only extremely poor sanitation, and more than another billion have no access to clean drinking water. It is also a fact that half of the world's population, that is to say well over 4.3 billion human beings, suffer from water scarcity, and in each of these cases, the number will continue to grow in the future in relation to the unchecked, blatant increase in overpopulation. It is already the case today that in some places drinking water supplies are already being stretched much more than they can recover and be used. The problem of housing is also becoming more and more precarious, because the uncontrollably growing overpopulation is already bringing about a development that is almost impossible to cope with, which is also connected with enormous financial resources, the necessary building sites, and all kinds of other difficulties. Many human beings live in extremely miserable conditions on the streets of cities in Europe, such as slab pushers, clochards, and other homeless people in Germany, Switzerland, France, Italy, and England, etc., while almost 2 billion more live in need, misery, and poverty in the slums of large cities, such as in Cape Town, Karachi, Lagos, Bombay/Mumbai, Nairobi, New Delhi, and Mexico City, whereby also in this respect the number will increase in relation to the still increasing overpopulation worldwide. The fact is and will remain that the more human beings populate the earth, the more the desire for prosperity, pleasure, and financial and material wealth will increase, which in turn will lead to more crime, but also to increasing envy towards wealthier people, and to more frequent and more degenerating violence. Furthermore, population growth will also lead to more degenerating machinations that destroy nature, fauna, flora, and the climate. Precisely in relation to the massively increasing worldwide overpopulation, which currently amounts to about 110 million human beings annually, in addition to the accounting of all annual deaths. If everything is considered carefully, then the growing number of Earth humans or the mass of the inexorably increasing overpopulation on Earth results in the worst threat to Earth humans of all times, whereby this threat, which hangs like a sword of Damocles over the future of the entire Earth population, naturally also affects the existence of nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the planet itself. And this threat is exacerbated by the rapid increase in overpopulation since the 1950s, with its worldwide destructive machinations in nature, fauna, flora, and the planet on top of it, whereby climate change as a catastrophic consequence of human irrationality brings further immense destruction and devastation, as well as endless misery and suffering to Earth humans. And all this can no longer be brought under control and can no longer be stopped, not even by loud-mouthed scientists, climate researchers, and politicians, etc., making stupid big speeches, pretending to understand and making themselves important. And they do this, although they understand nothing of the whole of the catastrophe that is already underway and spreading, because they do not even realize how badly and already hopelessly the whole doom has progressed and become an irreparable fiasco and disaster, which causes misfortune upon misfortune, and continually brings more and more unsolvable problems. And these problems, which have never appeared since the very first coming into being and existence of the human beings of the earth up to the present day, have already grown to such an extent at the present time that they can no longer be overcome. And this is because the majority of human beings on earth, as well as all types of government officials and their advisors and lobbyists, as well as the religious leaders and their helpers, sociologists, etc., lack the intellect, reason, and intelligence to perceive and recognize the actual reality and its truth, namely how devastatingly bad things really are on planet Earth, its nature, fauna, flora, atmosphere, and climate. Out of this blindness of not perceiving and not seeing, as well as not recognizing the effective facts with regard to all the destructions in all conceivable relationships in nature, on the planet, on the waters of all kinds, on fauna and flora, on the land, on the atmosphere, and on the climate, which have been catastrophically rampant on Earth for decades, the truth is still not recognized. In this regard, the blame for the catastrophe that has been rampant for decades and is becoming more and more precarious is founded, which has not even been recognized as such by those responsible for all earthly state leaderships, as well as by the scientists and experts and politicians, etc., responsible for it, and is still not recognized today. The fact is that up to the present time, all these experts and scientists, as well as the responsible state, rulers and politicians have time and again put forward and enacted only flimsy and stupid proposals and absolutely inadequate stupid measures for alleged climate protection, etc., which, however, are still not recognized as such. Which, however, in their senselessness, are not even worth as much as a drop on a hot stone that at least still evaporates. While all the bullshit of the politicians, rulers, scientists, climate researchers, and experts, etc., is not even able to produce a thin skin. This is precisely because they, in their lack of understanding, their lack of reason and their lack of intelligence, do not recognize that the reason for the entire catastrophe, which they also do not recognize as such in their real reality and cannot grasp, lies in the existing and still endlessly growing overpopulation. Well, the enormous quantities of greenhouse gases that have been blown into the atmosphere since the beginning of industrialization continue to increase uncontrollably every year because the ever-growing Earth humans demand more and more industrialization in order to create more and more products of all kinds that are needed and demanded by the mass of the uncontrollably increasing overpopulation. And this further industrialization, on the other hand, inevitably produces more greenhouse gases and cascades of dirt that are hurled into the atmosphere. And this in addition to the fact that every year millions of Earthlings who come of age also inevitably use more vehicles with explosion engines and other dirty vehicles of all kinds, and thus increase the total level of greenhouse gases enormously. Consequently, more and more exhaust gases are constantly polluting and harassing the atmosphere, rendering all inadequate plans of scientists, climatologists, and other experts to avert further damage due to global warming, etc., futile and completely useless before appropriate measures can even be conceived, let alone implemented. The effective carrying and nourishing capacity of planet Earth is calculated to be 529 million human beings by nature, who can be fed and sustained in abundance in a natural way. Although this number of human beings should not be set higher than 1.5 to 2.5 billion, as ancient calculations by the universal prophet Nocodemian prove for a planet like Earth. Earth humans do not pay any attention to these calculations. However, because in their irresponsibility they also do not care that the ecological carrying capacity of the planetary habitat in relation to the human masses, which today in 2018 already amounts to over 8.9 billion, has long since been exceeded. Already in 2022, in relation to the size and fertility of planet Earth, any naturally reasonable number of 529 million to at most 2.5 billion human beings will be massively exceeded by more than 9 billion, which will then not only mean overcrowding of the planet and enormous damage to the entire earthly ecology, but its complete overload. From an ecological point of view, this can absolutely no longer be seen as a trivial matter, because from this point of view, with regard to the totality of the interrelationships between the overpopulated Earth humans and their environment, the entire household of nature and thus also of all other living beings is disturbed and completely out of joint. And this is happening in such a way that the ever-worsening course of ecological destruction is becoming more and more blatant, because there is no insight on the part of the Earthlings, and therefore no way of counteracting the evil. Obstruction or prevention would have to begin by enlightening and instructing earthly mankind, by bringing them to realization, to understanding, to reason, and thus also to an understanding of the effective state of affairs with regard to the danger and threat to the existence of mankind, the planet, and all life through overpopulation. And this would have to be done through enlightenment, by teaching all Earth humans to understand and also to comprehend and to be willing to drastically curb the overpopulation growth through a birth stop of several years, and also to completely stop any generation of offspring for certain years. This would also mean that it would have to be taught and understood that thereafter offspring would only be produced in accordance with a sensible, state-designed and intentional birth control, which would have to be brought to a normal, Earth-tolerable level in order to preserve humanity, nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet. This would be a correct way to reduce the mass of Earth human overpopulation thoroughly, effectively, efficiently, emphatically, massively, severely, strictly, rigorously, decisively, harshly, sharply, relentlessly, gravely and energetically to a low number suitable for both the recovery of the Earth resource-exploited planet, its largely destroyed nature and fauna and flora, the waters, the climate, the atmosphere, and for the entire environment in terms of forests, meadows, fields, and floodplains, good and positive, and thus also regenerative, even if regeneration must ultimately be expected to take tens of thousands of years. The effects of climate change, undoubtedly caused by earthly mankind, are already leading to much more frequent and catastrophic extreme weather, droughts and floods, respectively, to effective natural disasters. For various regions in different countries, it is precarious for the already existing populations. But especially for the irresponsibly growing population, it is to be feared that the supply of food, water, and many necessary necessities will no longer be sufficient. But this means, and this is proving to be the case more and more often, that also for this reason new conflicts will break out and murder, manslaughter and persecution will become more and more frequent and in the future uncontrollably rampant. And this is happening and will continue to happen far into the future. Among many other reasons, such as religious hatred and persecution, which will constantly create new conflicts and make the flow of refugees ever greater and more unstoppable. An example in this regard is the refugee flows of the Islamic Rohingya, hundreds of thousands of whom fled their homeland as of August 2017, fleeing the violence, persecution, and murder of the oh-so-peaceful Buddhist population of Burma. The Burmese believers in Islam, the Rohingya, have been persecuted in Burma since ancient times, so they have had to flee en masse, finding refuge in neighboring Bangladesh, which is one of the poorest and most densely populated countries in the world. However, the conditions in the provisional reception camps are extremely precarious, which leads to a new tragedy due to the monsoon season, or rainy season. A huge wave of refugees, unprecedented. Around 1 million members of the Burmese Rohingya crossed the border to Bangladesh within a few weeks from August 2017. All of them fled in panic from the unprecedented violence of the peaceful and philanthropic Buddhists. In fact, it was mainly the Burmese security forces who attacked, murdered, raped, and destroyed the home villages of the Islamic Rohingya. Every day, distraught and exhausted human beings fled empty-handed, creating the world's largest refugee camp in Bangladesh virtually overnight. Around 1 million Rohingya have since sought refuge in makeshift camps in the hinterland of the coastal city of Cox's Bazar in autumn 2017. Of all these people driven from their homes as a result of their religion and their religious belief in Islam, about 80% are women and children. The situations in the huge, confusing refugee camps are extremely precarious and are becoming increasingly so, because not only are hardship and misery spreading, but there is also the threat of disease and epidemics. The camps are completely overcrowded, and, as a result, the infrastructures are also tremendously overloaded. And if one thinks of the future of this stateless Islam-believing minority, what is to become of them and of their refugee status, then everything is absolutely uncertain. Now, a new tragedy is looming due to the monsoon season, which usually peaks in August. Consequently, the rains that have already started have caused slopes to slide, while violent monsoon storms damaged and in some cases completely destroyed the makeshift tents and huts made of bamboo canes and plastic sheets. Thousands of refugees had to be brought to safety. With regard to the greenhouse gases already mentioned, it should also be said that the global community, which is not really a global community, but only a disunited, unpeaceful, contradictory and hostile and loose disunity of states, agreed at the 2015 Climate Summit in Paris to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This was to prevent the global temperature from rising by more than 2 degrees above the level at the beginning of industrialization. Industrialization is defined as the development from the production of goods by manual labor to the production of goods by machines in factories. The basic country of origin of industrialization was England, because that is where the Industrial Revolution began around 1780, with emissions actually stagnating, in particular as a result of decreased emissions in the USA and China, after which, however, worldwide emissions have risen again since 2013 and 2016 and are continuing to rise. This will remain the case, however, because the emission reductions promised by the states since Paris are becoming smoke and mirrors or an illusion as a result of the endlessly growing overpopulation and the emissions that will inevitably continue to destroy the atmosphere. And this will be so because as a result of the growing Earth humans and their increasing needs, these can only be created with ever greater harmful emissions. So no better emission targets can be achieved, which is why a temperature increase of 4 or even 5 degrees is possible. Because the inexorably growing earthly humanity inevitably has ever-increasing higher demands and needs, which inevitably means that ever-increasing amounts of energy will continue to be needed, which will increase in the foreseeable future in such a way that they can only be produced in part with alternative technologies in the future, unless research leads to the invention of a total solution for energy production. Well, the fact is that emissions will again increase drastically in the coming decades, and thus will not decrease. Because it has long been demonstrable that the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere continues to grow faster and faster. Even if humanity were to succeed in exploiting the planet's resources in such a sustainable way, and inventing and creating new things that 11 or more billion Earthlings could be supplied with them, the question would still arise as to how and in what way all the billions of descendants would have to exist on an Earth with destroyed nature, fauna, flora, and a broken climate, because then it would no longer be possible to speak of life. If overpopulation continues to be driven up irresponsibly, then the Earth humans' violent catastrophe is indeed unstoppable. And the fact that this mega catastrophe is actually imminent in the future is also contributed to by greed, hatred, faith, luxury, wealth, poverty and injustice, as well as terrorism, false laws, lack of relationships among human beings, indifference, violence, coercion, lack of social welfare, discord, as well as drugs, alcohol, addiction to pleasure, diseases, epidemics and vices, etc. This is because in all these relationships the behavior of the human beings of the Earth, as well as their reactions in relation to present and future development, are degenerating more and abnormally. If we take a closer look, this is particularly evident in the industrial nations, for in these the whole moral degeneration, the decline of understanding, reason, and intelligence of the human beings is particularly evident as a result of the wrong development in practically all conceivable human behavior. Because of this, and precisely because it could only result from the enormous number of human beings of overpopulation, the greatest environmental and weather catastrophes, etc., have been caused in the past 9 decades, and irreparable climate change and climate damage has been caused, which is effectively climate destruction. The relatively huge overpopulation of earthly human beings creates a much greater ecological damage and destruction imprints per capita from the human beings in the industrialized countries than from the human beings in the developing and emerging countries. If all the human beings in the so-called third world countries also lived in the same way as those in the industrialized countries, then the Earth would already be on the brink of collapse or all-destroying collapse. The fact is that if, for example, the total energy consumption of a human being from childhood to adulthood is considered in the industrialized countries, this human being consumes 36 to 38 times more energy than a child in the developing and newly industrialized countries up to adulthood. It is also a fact that the human beings in these countries, in Africa, Asia, India and Latin America, as well as in Arabia and China, would like to have a comparable level of prosperity to that which prevails in the industrialized countries, although this development will certainly be a long time coming in the countries mentioned. This causes many human beings in these countries to flee their homelands, as a result of which they leave their countries like swarms of locusts and rush in great streams of refugees to the industrialized countries, especially to Europe, which is regarded in the third world countries as a paradise, so to speak, where wine and honey are supposed to flow. As a result of the flight of people from the refugee countries, the consumption of energy and resources in these countries should actually decrease significantly. However, this is not the case, because on the contrary, it continues to increase because companies and corporations of the industrialized countries and the refugee countries or developing and emerging countries are irresponsibly exploiting more and more resources and exploiting the earth, clearing forests and exploiting and robbing the still fertile lands through food plant plantations with monocultures. But also where the streams of refugees from third world countries, etc., strand in the industrialized countries. Energy consumption increases more and more in relation to the number of refugees who enter legally or illegally and inevitably become energy users in every vital respect. So there is no decrease in any state on Earth in terms of energy consumption, just as there is no decrease in CO2 emissions. And this despite the fact that the energy efficiency of all kinds of apparatus, working machines, automobiles, appliances, vehicles, and airplanes, etc., has developed strongly and ever higher. And the fact that more and more energy is needed and consumed is also due to the fact that more and more convenient inventions of the above-mentioned forms are being developed, manufactured, marketed, and used, which does not result in any energy savings but, on the contrary, in ever greater energy consumption, even when, for example, apparatus, working machines, vehicles, ships and airplanes, etc. consume significantly less fuel than before, and also pollute the atmosphere and breathing air for the human beings of the Earth and all living beings in general with fewer CO2 emissions. In principle, the first priority is to rigorously stop and prevent human population growth in order to then keep the Earth's population at a healthy and planetary level with a low reproduction rate. It is also necessary to significantly curb and drastically limit the depletion of resources and the consumption of energy and resources, and to distribute the resources that can still be used more fairly and sensibly. Equally, however, it is also necessary to save energy, as well as for all human beings on Earth to limit themselves with regard to all necessary relationships concerning the preservation of humanity and life of Earth humans, nature and its fauna and flora, etc., both in the wealthy industrialized countries and in the developing and newly industrialized countries, right down to the human beings in the poorest regions of the Earth. Only in this way is it possible that a change for the better and the good, and a benefit for the Earth's population as well as for nature, fauna, flora, and the climate can occur and have a long-term effect on the entire planet. It would be enormously important and helpful for all life, earthly humanity, nature, its fauna and flora, if human society would completely stop the growth of the Earth's population for 7 years and prevent 1 billion descendants and thus ideally reduce the population of the existing humanity rapidly also in a natural way, and also through the natural many millions of deaths. The idiocy of those stupid researchers and scientists is unbelievable who advocate incentives for more births and thus offspring, as they propagate this especially for some countries as a result of their shrinking populations. For Western women, a bonus is proposed that is not geared towards having only one child, or no child at all. This is supposed to stimulate a new way of thinking, and that the rich world, or the women of the rich, industrialized countries should take it as an example and model to give birth to just as many children in the rich world, as is the case in the developing and emerging countries, where contraception is often nothing more than a useless shot in the hot oven. And this, according to the bullshit of renowned researchers and scientists who obviously lack not only effective knowledge but also intellect. Reason and intelligence is supposed to be an important signal in the direction of a healthy world population, as is practiced in certain third world developing and emerging countries. As a rule, despite the overflowing overpopulation, moronic and irresponsible economic reasons are often cited for the fact that more children should be born in the industrialized countries, because otherwise society would age and the necessary labor force would be lacking. This is how the naive researchers, scientists, economists, sociologists, and other experts see the overall situation with regard to the creation of offspring. So they spin, oracle, whisper, threaten, and condemn every birth stop and every birth regulation in their moronic doomsaying and fantasize the downfall of the entire economy, as well as that of prosperity and old age pensions. In addition, they claim that the lack of new births also endangers the world of work because there are not enough workers to do all the necessary work. In contrast to this, however, is the effective fact that there are more than enough human beings in the world, also today, who would gladly fill all the gaps that arise on the labor market, if only they were given the chance to do so, and were not demanded to meet impossible idiotic requirements as work prerequisites that they cannot fulfill. Today, the integration of an Earth human being seeking work, woman or man, is a lottery in terms of getting a job as a result of the delusions of grandeur of the employers, in terms of the delusions of work training demanded of job seekers. Today, the whole thing is a wild and confused challenge for a job-seeking human being, which many job seekers cannot cope with because, on the one hand, many are already considered too old and rejects in their middle years of 40 to 45 years. But on the other hand, they cannot fulfill the idiotic requirements in terms of professional or work experience. As a matter of principle, it must also necessarily be said that offspring should in any case, in no case, and never be conceived and born to secure labor and old age pensions, and not even in such a way that they would have to maintain their own parents in old age, as was erroneously and confusedly the case in earlier times when masses of children were conceived and brought into the world for this purpose alone. Also to beget and give birth to offspring because it is simply nicer for society when children populate the world is just as inhumane, pathologically degenerated, stupid, and primitive. Offspring or children, when they are born, have to live, act, do, and work for their own sake, which is why it is absolutely irrelevant and does not matter what race, skin color, family, class, and descent they are. What is important is only what path they take in their lives, that they are righteous, cultivate a good and positive disposition, and how they will walk in the world of today and tomorrow with dignity and honor. And the only thing that must be important to them when they grow up is whether they want to be free or whether they want to commit themselves and whether they follow their natural urge to procreate or not against the background of global development. Consequently, they also think for themselves whether 1 or 2 children are enough for them.
A good and valuable monologue that calls the effective facts by their names.
This is also in line with my opinion, but I think you should now explain your accidental event before we continue our conversation.
Okay, the whole thing happened on the 1st of June, down in Tablat, but there is a short backstory to it, which starts with the fact that for years, an elderly man has been going from Goswell to Wheela and back again several times a week with 2 small ponies. He always leads the small pony on his left side and the bigger one on his right. As this always delights me when Eva and I pass by on our way to go shopping, I decided to donate something to the man's feed for the ponies, always remembering to approach him from the left side, just to the left of his little ponies, because I had already learned from Svath and also in farming to always approach animals of all kinds from the left side. On the 1st of June, the opportunity for my plan arose when Eva stopped the car about 30 meters from the man with the ponies, and I got out, which I realized, but then had a blackout. When I was able to think clearly again, I was lying in the meadow about 3 meters from the road and had tremendous pain in my right shoulder and upper arm. As it turned out, contrary to my knowledge, will and my usual behavior of always approaching living beings on the left, I had approached the man with the 2 ponies head-on, who had tied the 2 animals together and was holding them by his hands on the left and right. The result was that the ponies broke free from the man's hands and ran into the meadow, of course dragging me along with them and throwing me away because they were tied together. The pain was really intense, which is why Eva drove me to the Winterthur Cantonal Hospital without hesitation, where I was told during the first examination that the arm was dislocated and would therefore have to be put back in place. So I knew what to expect, because I had already undergone such a procedure once before at the age of 20, when I also dislocated my right arm as a result of a fall down a flight of stairs. Then, however, an X-ray was taken of my shoulder and upper arm in Winterthur Hospital, which showed that not only was the arm dislocated, but the armpit ball was shattered, and the upper arm bone was also broken underneath it, whereupon I was given a cuff to stabilize the upper arm and the dislocated armpit joint. I was then advised by the head doctor to have an operation to fit a new upper arm joint or ball and socket made of titanium. That is to say, a shoulder joint or ball and socket joint on the shoulder blade and a ball and socket joint on the upper arm. Naturally, the articular cartilage covers both the glenoid cavity and the ball, and thus enables the joint surfaces to glide optimally. Later, when it came to explaining the procedure to me, the assistant surgeon explained the exact circumstances and also the risks of the operation, explaining that there was a 30% certainty that everything would go well. And according to his explanation, the risk was really great because On the one hand, I would not have had to lie down for this operation, but would have had to be operated on in a semi-sitting position. And consequently, the transport of blood from the heart to the brain would have been much more difficult than if I had just been able to lie down. So the assistant surgeon clearly said that with the 30% certainty of success, on the one hand as a result of the circumstances of the operation, and on the other hand with regard to my aortic heart valve operation in 2015, I would really have a great risk of not surviving the operation. If not enough blood is pumped into the brain, 30 to 60 seconds would be enough for an exodus to occur. He also gave me some of this in writing, in relation to the further risks if the operation were successful. It says here in this protocol that 1. There would be a risk of coma, and 2. Of cardiovascular collapse, which would probably have meant that I could have taken the black box and the screws for it right away, and then screwed it shut. An arm amputation was listed as the third risk, while something was explained in the fourth place that I have forgotten and which I also cannot decipher here on this information protocol. But I can read out briefly what was written here in this protocol.
Diagnosis: displaced fracture of the left humerus in several parts with poor bone quality and probably circulatory disturbances of the head fragment, pre-damaged rotational cuff. The fact that this prognosis refers to the left, that is to say the left arm, whereas in reality it is the right arm, can be overlooked. And what is described as a fracture of the humerus on the left in several parts means that the joint ball is effectively shattered and the humerus directly under it is fractured throughout. Without surgery, dysfunction, chronic pain, malposition, circulatory disturbance of the individual fragments, head necrosis. This is the prognosis if surgery is not performed. I searched the internet to find out what is meant by head necrosis and found the following, and now I know that there is also hip head necrosis. But in my case, it is meant as humeral head necrosis. Humeral head necrosis or humeral head necrosis is the death of the bone of the humeral head, often for unknown reasons and to varying degrees. As a result, the bone of the humeral head becomes soft and less load-bearing in the loading zone. This causes the surface and the cartilage on the surface of the humeral head to deform to varying degrees. This is how the joint breaks down. The pain in the upper arm slowly increases over weeks and months. It is felt in the shoulder or the upper arm and also torments sufferers at night. Over time, the pain-causing posture can lead to restricted shoulder movement and even stiffness of the shoulder. A cracking and/or rubbing sensation may occasionally occur. In most cases, however, the disease is already more advanced. If left untreated, humeral head necrosis or humeral head necrosis leads to destruction and deformation of the humeral head. Due to the circulatory disturbance, the bone softens and is no longer strong enough to bear weight. The bone deforms and the humeral head becomes rounded. This eventually leads to wear and tear in the shoulder-head joint, with corresponding rubbing, pain, inability to use and restricted movement. If left untreated, humeral head necrosis causes the bone to soften more and more as a result of the disturbed blood circulation in the humeral head. This means that it becomes less load-bearing and its surface sags. It deforms. Consequently, the shoulder joint no longer runs smoothly, and there is abrasion of the cartilage bone in the shoulder. As a result, the pain in the shoulder usually worsens over time, and with increasing humeral head necrosis. X-ray or CT core MRI can show the increasing de-rounding of the humeral head and narrowing of the glenohumeral joint space. Subsequently, the shoulder joint becomes increasingly stiff, and the destruction and pain in the shoulder so obvious that an artificial shoulder joint shoulder prosthesis becomes necessary. This is therefore the prognosis according to this information protocol for the case without surgery and without the insertion of an artificial joint ball and a new joint socket made of titanium. Although the following is stated here with regard to surgery. With surgery, various procedures, possible reconstruction, anatomical partial prosthesis, inverse prosthesis. The aim is to achieve the best possible function and freedom from pain with preservation of independence. Treatment alternatives: no surgery, chronic pain and shoulder stiffness likely. Partial prosthesis? Poorer function is to be expected. Reconstruction, not recommended due to the fracture pattern, restricted blood supply, avital bone parts. Surgery, entering the humeral head, opening the rotational interval and setting down the long biceps tendon, removal of the head fragments. The bony attachments of the musculature are sutured on adjusting the glenoid and preparing for the glenoid. Component, attachment of these components with screws, cementless, in the correct orientation, preparing the upper arm shaft medullary cavity, cementing in the shaft component, reduction of the prosthesis and reflexation of the prepared tubercle, relining with own bone, possibly fixation of the long biceps tendon, possibly read-on drainage, wound closure in layers, dry dressing and abduction pad, possible general complications. Hematoma with necessary reoperation is rare. Infection locally, usually joint involvement, follow-up surgery necessary, wound healing disorder, thrombosis and pulmonary embolism, possible operation, specific complications, nerve damage or irritation through surgical access, in this case mainly the axillary nerve, explanation from the internet. The axillary nerve is a nerve of the brachial plexus. In human beings, it has its roots in the spinal cord between the 5th and 7th cervical segments, C5-C6, in domestic animals in C6-C8. Rarely injury to blood vessels or nerves leading into the arm, possible long-term restriction of movement in the shoulder joint, loosening of the prosthesis, prosthesis dislocation, bone fracture during surgery or later periprosthetic fracture, acromion fracture. Occasionally there is excessive bone resorption with strong inflammatory manifestations and pain complex regional pain syndrome. Special risk factors of the patient: AAM, coma, HK cardiovascular failure, amputation. Cannot be read, deciphered. Special remarks: a functional impairment of the shoulder often remains.
So that is the description of the specialist explanations for the operation regarding my accidental injury, whereby the operation was scheduled for Monday, the 19th of June 2018 at 11:30 HRS. However, when the assistant surgeon later explained the risks of the operation in relation to my case, I was struck by strange thoughts and feelings which led me to decide not to have the operation. And that's that. Because since then, I have been trying to get the arm back under control by doing all kinds of movement exercises myself. And I am also having good success with it, because as you can see, I can already move the arm well.
Your mobility with your arm amazes me very much because what you are able to do is not really possible after only 2 months after the accident. And besides, every movement should cause you a lot of pain.
You have also seen during your visits lately that I have been doing movement exercises again and again, and that there has always been a lot of pain. But I think that I can only use my arm again and make it work if I bear the pain and do not slacken in the movement exercises. So I just do not pay attention to them and just let them go crazy, even if it's hard sometimes. But the main thing is that the arm becomes able to move again, and it does not matter if the pain sometimes almost makes my brain burst.
What you read out of the recon protocol is equivalent to barbaric bungling, but not medical knowledge and skill.
You forget that I live here on Earth, and the medical knowledge of the Earthlings is still tremendously behind what is commonplace among you Playaran.
That is so, of course, but still it is barabari and bumbling, and to that I wonder how you can get along with it.
He makes his own medicine by being mentally correct, and also doing all that is necessary according to his own ability. Of course I know that. But still it never ceases to amaze me how Edward copes with such happenings that affect him, and also copes with great pain, how it must be really very disabling in the case of the serious injury.
You should not start talking shop about this, and besides, everything you wanted to know has probably been said and explained. So let that be enough with what has been said and explained. And also with the fact that I do not need to be told how many more months the pain will last, and that I must diligently continue to do range of motion exercises to get the arm back in order.
Of course. But how you can move and use your arm again just 2 months after the accident without specialist medical intervention and help is still more than extremely amazing to me.
It is always the case that you have to do something yourself and enough if you want to climb a green branch. So I also want to see to it and do everything possible to make my arm fully functional again. Even when the pain is going crazy, which is especially the case with movement exercises and certain work activities, as well as when I am working on the computer. I only hope that I will really succeed and that the nasty risk diagnoses will not come to the fore, as they have been painted as the consequences of not having the operation.